The Honourable Brad Pettit.
Thank you, President. I rise tonight to talk about an issue which certainly many of my constituents have raised with me, and it's one which perhaps is a difficult issue to talk about in some ways, because it's actually around the treatment of some members of our community over more recent times by the police. And what I'm talking about here is climate activists in our community. And I want to be clear that I'm not alone in talking about this. It's certainly in a trend that's been talked about by human rights groups and NGOs who actually talk about this trend not just in WA or not just in Australia. This is a global trend. And I raise it because I don't want WA to go down this path. And I want to be clear at the start of this member statement, this is not an attack on the West Australian Police Force, who in my experience have many good, hard-working people working with them, doing a very good job. And I must say, in my time as the Mayor of Fremantle, I had a very good relationship with many of them. But we have seen, I think, a particular group of police, I think, involved in what I would see as overreach. And the danger of that is that it undoes the confidence that the broader community has in our police force as a whole, and has, I think, in the rights of our democratic processes, where I think protest is very much at the heart of a good democratic community, which I'll come back to at the end. Now, this is an issue that's kind of happened pretty recently. Going back to 2021, when Rosa Hicks' home was raided by West Australia's counter-terrorism police over some chalk. Literally over some chalk on a overpass, only a stone's throw from here. She was arrested with one of 6 people after washable chalk paint was written on a pedestrian bridge between here and Woodside's headquarters over a protest over the $16 billion Scarborough gas project. Now, 2 weeks after this, in August 2021, officers with the State Security Investigation Group, otherwise known as the state's counter-terrorism police, raided the home of Rosa Hicks and other activists in the early hours of the morning. I mean, first thing is why, I think it's an interesting question, why is they happening? Now, Hicks wasn't even involved in applying the paint. I mean, it is chalk anyway, and had arrived after the protesters had started. Now, Magistrate Matthew Holgate threw out this case on the grounds it had no legal basis, and WA police were ordered to cover Hicks' legal costs. Sophie McNeill, the Australian researcher with Human Rights Watch, described this decision in Hicks' case as a sensible outcome to an overzealous prosecution. Now, this was 18 months ago. Unfortunately, what we've seen is more of these kind of things happened, and more recently, police engaged in similar tactics, and I think what most fair-minded people would also define as overreach. Searching people's homes, bringing them to jail, often keeping them in jail overnight, seizing personal belongings like phones and laptops, often for weeks on end. And I want to read out some testimony of some members of the community and what's happened to them when they've engaged in peaceful protest. Now, I suspect many of you will be aware of the protests at Joanna Patika, who had spray painted on a piece of Perspex in front of a painting at the WA Art Gallery. She had her house turned upside down for doing this. And I want to read a statement that she gave to me. She says, at the point my home was raided by the WA police, my criminal charge matter in relation to the art gallery action had been resolved in the judicial system. I'd been convicted and I'd paid the large fine handed to me. The subsequent raid on my home and seizure of my property by the State Security Unit, which is deployed for serious matters including counter-terrorism, is baffling, unjustified and clearly demonstrates how desperate the state government is to cover up their dependence on and capture by Woodside and big fossil polluters. The entire experience left me feeling quite vulnerable. I had 6 large police officers in bulky bulletproof vests forced their way into my tiny apartment. Now, anyone who's met Joanna, she's a very petite woman, and the idea, I can imagine 6 officers coming in, and then she goes on to say, rifling through every single one of my personal belongings, they stood there, reading through my private thoughts and my diaries, searching through my dirty laundry hamper, and non-consensually filming me for their own records. I couldn't do a thing about it. It was violating, dehumanising, and I'm not quite sure I've processed it all. Again, I don't think that classes a couple. Why you need 6 police in bulletproof vests to raid someone whose fine has been paid for doing something non-violent, I think doesn't cut it. But this experience is similar to someone else in the community, Trent Rojahan, who also wrote to me, and he said, the police entered my home, read my charges and arrested me from my living room. At the time, I did not have my mobile phone on me, and they asked me if I had one, and I said no comment. Then they aggressively threatened to raid my house if I did not produce it. They gave me no warrant or grounds to seize my phone, and out of a fear of a raid, I produced the phone, which they took. I spent almost 3 hours in a cell before being able to return home. About 6 weeks later, I still had my phone returned to me, and no explanation as to why that is the case. It has scared me quite a lot. The idea that uniformed police can turn up any time, enter my home and aggressively take my property without producing valid means to act is terrifying. And I agree. I think it's unacceptable. And of course, more recently, we had Violet Coco, who many of you might know, who was made quite famous by her protest in Sydney on the Harbour Bridge. She did a peaceful direct action here as well at Wapol, and which also landed her in a night over jail. Now, interestingly, the magistrate, the next morning when she appeared in front of Magistrate Matthew Walton, said, and I quote, she had appeared to have legitimate personal beliefs. It is noble and commendable people who have strong personal views. It's a fundamental tenet of Western democracy, a functioning democracy, and it should be supported. You don't have to go too far abroad to see restrictions on personal freedoms and activism. And Coco was ordered to pay $500 in damages. But this idea, and we also saw one final example, where 3 others were also detained after the Woodside AGM, one of them being a mum of 3, actually someone I know from Fremantle, was also kept in jail overnight. And a colleague of one of these people who was up at Marujuka had their home raided, being totally unrelated to it, and their SD card seized and their camera received, even though they weren't part of that protest. There is a concern, and I think there is a pattern here that worries me of excessive treatment of peaceful protesters. Democracy is based on that. The fact that women vote is based on peaceful protest. In fact, some of the suffragettes actually weren't that peaceful, but their protests were essential. It is an essential part of a democratic society. It enables social progress, it holds governments accountable, and is a backbone for many of the positive changes we have seen. Not only environmental protection, but women's rights and, of course, workers' rights. And I am concerned that this heavy hand against protesters, and I'll say it again, by a small number or part of the West Australian Police Force, I think is problematic, and I think it actually doesn't pass what I think is reasonable, a reasonable way of acting. What these protesters are protesting about is actually entirely legitimate. Every credible climate scientist on the planet is begging us, political leaders in this place, to stop new coal and gas projects. And it's understandable across Australia and WA, where we don't have, which in WA we certainly don't have science-based legislative targets, and we're still seeking to expand the gas industry. I get why people are protesting. In fact, I admire it. And I think it's in some ways they feel the only way that they can actually try to actually bring the very big issues in front of us to the government's attention. And that is why peaceful protest is so important. So we do need to enable peaceful protest, and we need to keep, I think, this overreach towards peaceful protesters by police in check. And I think it's not good enough, and it's a trend that I am concerned is happening. We're seeing it all over the world, and it's certainly not something that I think belongs here in Western Australia, a place that has been built on democratic principles and free speech. And I raise it here by hoping to shine a light on this disturbing trend. I hope that in doing so that it is stopped and reversed, because I do think that we are a better state than this.